My name is April. Pronouns are she, her. I am a member of the National Political Education Committee, and we are the ones who have hosted this really great call tonight. I'm so excited that everyone is here to join us. The National Political Education Committee both hosts national events and provides support for local political education through trainings, peer mentoring, and educational materials. So if you're doing political education work in your DSA chapter and would like to get in touch, please contact us at politicaleducation@dsausa.org. I am very lucky to be on this committee, and I am really excited to bring together two things that I'm really passionate about, education and my disdain for the police. And that is exactly what we are talking about today. Our guest speaker today is Alex Vitale. Alex Vitale is a professor of sociology and the coordinator of Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. He's also a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both with police departments and human rights organizations internationally. He is also the author of the book, The End of Policing, and he is joining us here today for a discussion of that book. Thank you so much for joining us, Alex.
You bet, April. I'm really happy to be here.
So stoked. So let's get into it. In your book, you lay out basically the origins of policing. So could you start off by giving us a brief history of the evolution of police forces from like the slave patrols to the present, and give us a little bit of a layout of the influence that the US has had on police force development internationally, specifically like the CIA training of forces like all over the world and how those practices came back here to the United States.
Sure, and let me just start by giving a shout out to my home chapter, the Central Brooklyn branch of the New York City chapter, and also in the amazing chat thread, I saw that my kind of home away from home chapter, where I attended their general meeting last night, is the Cape Cod chapter of DSA, where I've been living the last 6 months. So to answer your question, so I think it's important to think about policing in terms of its functional nature. And what I argue in the book is that policing gets created as a modern institution about 200 years ago in relationship to three principal forms of economic exploitation that dominate the political and economic environment of the late 18th and early 19th century. And these three forms of exploitation are colonialism, slavery, and industrialization. And what we see is that police forces are created when those regimes of exploitation need additional state tools of violence to keep them going. But it's not just the violence, because they could just rely on military forces. They choose to create civilian policing in order to create a system that has greater legitimacy, that is sold as being civilian, more nuanced, less violent, more preemptive than just having the militia line up and shoot at strikers or massacre colonial subjects or slaves. So what does this look like in practice? Well, I argue that the first police force created anywhere that fits the kind of modern definition of a police force is the Charleston City Watch and Guard, that's created in the very late 1700s. They're uniformed, professional, 24-hour, law enforcement oriented, but the legal system that they're enforcing is primarily the laws around slavery. In Charleston and most of the big cities of the American South, slaves actually work outside of the home of their owners. They work on wharves, in factories, in warehouses, and the wages that they're paid then go to their owner. But this means that there's a large population of mobile slaves moving about the city day and all during the day. And in many of these cities, blacks actually outnumber whites. And this produces a tremendous and not unreasonable fear of slave uprisings, which did occur periodically. They're also concerned about the precursors to that, the formation of underground societies, of reading groups, and policing is created to prevent this from happening, to micromanage the movement of this huge mobile slave population. And that then becomes the urban policing of the South after emancipation. In the rural areas, slave patrols that patrol rural roads to look for runaway slaves or slaves out in places they shouldn't be, they play a similar role, but not quite as direct a connection to everyday policing as we sometimes hear talked about. But in the American North, the situation is very different. While early police forces do play a role in managing the lives of a very small, at that time, black population, looking for runaway slaves and micromanaging the behavior of that population that's there lawfully as well as unlawfully, the main impetus for creating these police forces, and the vast majority of what they do, is actually tied to questions of industrialization. They're trying to mold this massive influx of new immigrants into a stable and essentially a docile working class through the suppression of strikes, of workers' movements, but also through the micromanagement of their everyday public behavior. The intense scrutiny even of things like public dress codes that were enforced during these periods in places like Chicago and New York. And also, they are suppressing the political movements. They are shutting down the taverns and pubs that are a source of political organizing through anti-liquor laws and eventually prohibition. Now, the first state police force, and this will get, I think, to the heart of your question that shows this interchange. The first state police force in the United States is the Pennsylvania State Police, created in 1905. They were needed because local police were either unwilling or unable to put down the organizing that's happening in the coal and iron fields of Pennsylvania during that period. And so they need a new force that's large enough and politically tied to the state government, not localities, that's willing to, suppress these movements. And the model for this new state police force is the U.S. occupation forces in the Philippines, which at this point is a U.S. colonial possession, which we got at the end of the Spanish-American War. And they actually bring individual people as well as new technologies and methods from the Philippines to Pennsylvania to suppress these workers' movements. The workers organizing in this period refer to them as the Pennsylvania Cossacks, to give you a sense of their brutality and their overtly political nature. And we had our own domestic colonial police force, which was the Texas Rangers, whose primary mission was the extermination of the indigenous population and the pushing out of Mexican and Spanish landholders to make way for white settlement. And when there was resistance, they would use violence. My friend Stuart Schrader has written a fantastic book called Badges Without Borders that looks at how this interplay between US imperialism and domestic policing has continued to play out throughout the 20th century. And that this is a two-way exchange. This is not just about, we have counterinsurgency in Vietnam and then that comes to Los Angeles. No, it's actually police from throughout the United States who go and become part of the foreign policy apparatus in Vietnam, part of developing counterinsurgency technologies, and then some of those people come back, and there's a constant two-way exchange. And Stuart's book does a great job of laying out that history, which continues to today in formal and informal ways.
Now it's
Had to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Let's switch gears just a little bit. In a Jacobin interview that you gave in June, you were asked, how should the movement for defunding the police confront the entrenched power of police unions who stand in the way of even the most basic reforms? And how does our fight against such unions relate to accusations of our being anti-union? Could you just walk us through your perspective and your answer that you gave?
Yeah, I think this has become a terribly important question, and I think that there are, kind of legitimate differences of opinion here. Now, I am a fourth generation unionist. The Vitales were coal miners in Southern Illinois, and I'm a state, worker in New York. I'm part of the American Federation of Teachers, and I was recently served 2 terms as a vice president of the CUNY Professional Staff Union. So I'm not in the business of breaking unions. I think that this is a dangerous tactic that will inevitably play into the hands of a broader anti-union politics, which is very prevalent in the United States. I think instead, what we need to do is 2 things. One is we need to make it clear that police unions, or whatever they call, because many of them don't even consider themselves unions in the first place, they should not be part of our labor movement. They should not be part of the big internationals, and they should not be part of the AFL-CIO. And I think this is very important to push this, to drive them out of central labor councils, et cetera, because they are inherently a danger to our movement. And they consistently sell out the rest of the labor movement whenever it is convenient for them to do so. The second thing we have to do is we have to neutralize their political influence in as many ways as we can. And one of the most important is to go after the process of them endorsing and giving money to politicians. And the reality is a lot of Democrats in a lot of cities around the country take these endorsements and this police money, and then claim to be our friends, claim to be acting in our interests. And we have to make clear that it's not possible, that when you take that money, you cannot be our friend anymore. Because that money does not just stand for, oh, well, we want another 2% on our pension, or, we want a little bit better of healthcare package. No, that money comes with a whole political ideology, a kind of thin blue line, Blue Lives Matter worldview that says that, the world is divided up into good people and bad people, and we need police to separate those two and to wipe out the people on the bad side. And that ideology reduces all our social problems to questions of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions, violence, and coercion. And that worldview is fundamentally opposed to any kind of democratic socialist vision of using the state to repair past harms, to lift up individuals, to rebuild and strengthen communities. And so we have to call out any politician who's taking that money and taking those endorsements and say, we cannot work with you, we will not endorse you, and we will campaign against you.
Okay. So outside of a socialist framework, we hear a lot of people, not all cops and some cops are good, but within a socialist framework, where do cops exactly lie? Some people argue that they're not a part of the working class because they don't have the same working class interest, or because their entire goal is to protect property in the ruling class. So where do police officers individually lie in the class struggle? What place do they have?
I think there are class enemies. George Orwell had a funny quote. He said, I stumbled upon a fight in the street between some police officers and some workers. And he's like, I didn't really need to know the details of this encounter to know which side of this struggle I was on, right? That the police officer is the natural enemy of the working class. And the particular economic status of individual police officers, not to mention their attitude about unions or other questions or racial justice, is largely irrelevant. because the structural forces at play neutralize those individual characteristics. When push comes to shove, as it literally has all summer, we see very clearly where police allegiance lies and what difference their individual attitude makes, which is close to none.
Okay. So in your answer, basically you said we should limit the power of these police unions or groups or whatever they're called. Should they exist at all? Should it be our number one goal to dissolve these unions? What do we do with them?
Yeah, I don't think strategically that's a good idea. As I said before, I think once we start legitimating the idea that people's right to form a union is some kind of political litmus test question, then I think we really open ourselves up to all kinds of right-wing attacks. If people self-organize, there's very little also that we can do about this. I think that the one other thing is that, you know, their power derives from their ability to get politicians to enter into collective bargaining agreements with them. And we tend to blame the unions for those collective bargaining agreements. But a collective bargaining agreement requires two sets of signatures, right? They're bargaining with these local governments who sign off on these terrible contracts that absolve them of any responsibility or accountability for their actions and encourage all kinds of, you know, problematic political arrangements. So we have to continue to hold elected officials accountable for giving in to these police unions. And that's why I think it's so strategically important to focus on the endorsements and the money. We found when folks looked at the recent vote in New York City on the budget, which did not defund the police, did not cut the police budget significantly, and a group of politicians voted against the entire budget as a result, when we looked at the people who voted for the budget, we found that they had received tens of thousands of dollars in police and corrections endorsement money, and the people who voted against the budget had not. There was a dramatic difference here. And so all those people who voted for the budget, who claim to be our friends, have to be called out on this. And a huge number of these people, Black, brown, Asian, working class, whatever, they say they get to go around saying they're progressives. And we have to call bullshit on that.
Okay. Since the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the movement to defund the police is finally starting to gain traction across this country. There have been some debates about definitions, so I'd just like for you to go over your definition of what defunding and then what exactly police abolition means.
Okay, in 2 minutes right now. So I think we have a growing clarity about what defund the police means. It does not mean that there's some magical switch hidden somewhere that we can just turn off and then tomorrow there are no police, right? There's no city council that's going to zero out the police budget tomorrow. Because the scaremongering, the right-wing resistance, and even a lot of moderate resistance is about, oh, they're going to defund the police and then it'll be a free-for-all and it'll be chaos in the streets and it'll be the purge. And no one who's actually organizing in the defund movement that I've come across in the last 3 years is saying anything like that. What they're saying is we need to undertake a process of systematically interrogating why cities are spending 20, 25, 30, 40% of their budgets on policing, while communities have no mental health care services, failing schools, no drug treatment access, no family supports, etc. And so what they're demanding is transferring funds from policing and jails and youth facilities and things like that to actual community identified public safety needs. Now that in and of itself is not necessarily police abolition. Police abolition is something a little bit more all-encompassing, a little bit deeper analysis, but they're not inconsistent, I would say. So what does police abolition mean to me? Well, it means three things. First, it's about an analysis. It's an analysis that says that policing, by its nature, is a tool for facilitating exploitation and inequality along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. And that's the fundamental nature of that institution. It's not about public safety. It's not about public health. It's not even really about crime. And crime, of course, goes in quotes here, right? It's about, when push comes to shove, it's about reproducing inequality. Now, that analysis helps us to avoid making certain kinds of mistakes. It prevents us from thinking that we can fix this problem by giving police implicit bias training, or by hiring a few Black police officers, or giving them mindfulness training, which they had in Minneapolis, because those trainings, those interventions, body cameras, etc., they're designed to restore the professionalism and legitimacy of policing. They're there to increase public acceptance of policing. But what they don't do is interrogate in any meaningful way the substantive outcomes of policing. So if we look at, for instance, the racism of the drug war, we're not going to be able to solve that racism by giving narcotics units anti-bias training. This is ridiculous. We have to end the war on drugs. That's the only way we're going to make any progress on this. It's also about a process. Abolition is also about a process. It's not about today we have police and tomorrow we have no police. It's about the kinds of things the defund movement is talking about. It's about building up community resources and community power so that we can produce public safety in non-coercive, non-punitive, non-violent ways as much as we possibly can. So it's not just about getting rid of police. It's about producing healthy, safe communities so that policing is seen more clearly to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. So that means investing in the kinds of things I mentioned before: universal access to high quality mental health and substance abuse services, access to quality housing, stable employment, family supports, decent education. These are the things that really produce public safety for people. Finally, it's about a vision. Abolition is about a vision of the future. It's about thinking about what a world would look like that doesn't rely on people with guns and putting human beings into cages. And I think everyone ultimately would like to live in a world like that, that doesn't rely on those things to create social stability. We want to create societies rooted in solidarity and mutual aid that resolve problems and deal with harms in ways that aren't about Xing people out, driving divisions between people, but about trying to repair harms, restore people. So I think that's a vision that when we have the opportunity to explain it to people and to say, we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like, and we're not exactly sure what the 7 scientific steps are to get there. No one says they've got it all figured out. But when we take the time to say, this is the vision, these are the deeply held principles behind what we're doing, I think there's a lot of room for common ground there. And so that's what abolition means to me. And I don't want to speak for the rest of the movement, because there are differences of opinion about these things, but this is what's guided my view on this subject over decades of organizing.
Thank you. last kind of question, speaking of like this vision and like the overarching movement, you've been looking at police departments over the last 30 years, and we've seen so much momentum just this summer. I'm wondering, in your expert opinion, are you seeing any particular kinds of demands that are more effective or less effective, or any movements in particular cities that were not effective that we can learn from? Like, what specific city level demands will propel us forward into like getting closer to that end goal of, you know, idealistic abolition?
So I think, you know, local dynamics really matter here. And I had the huge pleasure of being able to travel every other week up until COVID over the last 3 years, and to meet with, I saw on the chat many places I've been to. And, you know, not all communities face exactly the same public safety, public health challenges. So we do need strategies that are tailored to local places. And I often say that the way to start this process is to do a local needs assessment, to try to get people in the community to come together and talk openly and concretely about what the things are that they think need to be dealt with, you know, as public safety issues, and that have been dealt with by the police. Some of this is going to be imagined fear-based things that aren't real, and maybe if we put them on the table, we can help neutralize them. But some of them are real and some of them are legitimate. There is violence. There are real problems in places, and we need real strategies to address those things. So having said that, some of the things that have seemed to be making progress, that are kind of maybe a tip of the spear or a leading edge here, is there've been some big victories about getting police out of schools. The last trip I made before COVID was to Portland, Maine, to do an event there with some local organizations, and they won their battle to get police out of the schools there. Oakland, similarly, other places are making big strides on this. The other is around the use of police to respond to kind of mental health, homelessness crisis, substance abuse related calls. A lot of talk about the CAHOOTS model in Oregon, which is a independent nonprofit outreach support rooted in a community clinic. And they are integrated into the 911 system, so that if someone says, I see a homeless person in distress, or my son is having a mental health crisis, you get a trained health outreach response, not a police response. So places like Albuquerque and San Francisco and Los Angeles, you know, a lot of places that are saying they want to move in this direction, and we're seeing real progress there. So I think those are two of the leading edges, but there are also really important movements underway to decriminalize sex work, to decriminalize marijuana and possibly other drugs, which I think is tremendously important. There are, you know, movements around border policing. So I don't think we should limit ourselves. We have to assess the local political environment, but ultimately it's about creating a kind of majoritarian politics. So we have to be mindful about what it's going to take in terms of talking to our neighbors, talking to our friends, talking to our families, to convince people that these are better strategies for making them safe, for making them safer than they are with the current arrangement.
Thanks. We have a few minutes of time left. We've got almost like 390 people on this call. A lot of them are organizing across the country to defund the police. I guess, could you give us some parting words of wisdom? What is the one thing that you haven't mentioned that all organizers need to know, take away from this call going forward in order to be successful in defunding?
Well, I think one of the things that has so impressed me about DSA, and one of the reasons I joined DSA, was that there's an understanding about the difference between activism and organizing. in a lot of spaces I've been in, there are a lot of activists who you can count on to go to a protest, to hold a sign, maybe even to come to a meeting to figure out logistics. But when it comes to getting them to talk to someone they don't know and to move them from point A to point B on that issue, that's organizing. And many of them, they're not ready to do that, or that's alien to them, or they feel like that's too scary. And DSA has been successful precisely because it's filled with organizers, not just activists. So it's a real drag. We can't knock on doors right now. We can't stand in front of shopping malls with clipboards. So we have to be creative about finding those person-to-person organizing opportunities. But I think that's where the strength of this organization has been, and that's what it's going to take to build this new majoritarian politics that this country so desperately needs.
I just want to take some time to thank you so much for taking your time to speak with us today. And just thanks. That was awesome. The next bit of time we're going to take to look at some of those organizers that Alex just talked about that are doing work across the nation. So we're going to start with a representative from Seattle DSA. If you want to unmute, turn your cam on. Thanks, Chuck.
Is there time for questions?
We will have discussion at the very end, but no, we didn't allot any time for questions in this little setup. So sorry. Chuck, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you, April. So hi, everyone. My name is Chuck McKeever, he, him. I'm representing Seattle DSA and AFT 1789. The situation I'm going to be talking to you about for the next couple of minutes is just one component of Seattle DSA's work. In an official capacity, our chapter has been involved with the protest movement to defund the police, getting police out of schools, and the larger movement for Black Lives. But there are also a number of Seattle DSA members who are also union members. And there was an unofficial coalition of us that worked on something very important back in June, namely getting the Martin Luther King County Labor Council to remove the Seattle Police Officers Guild, or SPOG, from its ranks. We thought this was a necessary step to take because of many of the reasons that Alex just mentioned in his talk. The political power that the Labor Council has, its endorsements and its contributions go a long way in King County. And when push has come to shove in the past, the council's executive board has stood with the relatively tiny police union against the interests of working people in Seattle. One example is the police union pushing the council to endorse against incumbent Socialist City Council member Shama Sawant in her re-election bid last year. This came after Sawant was the lone vote against ratifying SPOG's new contract the year before, which rolled back a whole bunch of accountability measures. So we thought this was a really important project to undertake. And the main strategy that we employed in winning this particular demand of getting SPOG out of the County Labor Council was pure heavy pressure from the rank and file members of unions across the county. It started with the caucus of rank and file educators in the Highline School District, which is just south of Seattle. And they began circulating a petition asking BIPOC union members to sign on to demand SPOG's expulsion. Those same organizers then asked white union members countywide to initiate pressure on their own leadership to sign on to these demands. And so within days, the executive board of the Labor Council had issued a short, very toothless list of demands that SPOG had to meet in order to stay in the council's ranks. Obviously, this wasn't enough to mollify us, and we continued to demand a formal vote on expulsion. So we started a rapid period of organizing and vote whipping by rank and file members across a number of locals. People got together to write the formal motion itself that would expel the Police Officers Guild, to map their networks, to count sure yes votes, to call and email their own union leadership to put pressure on them. It's important to note not everyone involved in this effort was a Seattle DSA member, but Seattle DSA showed up big. Our members from locals affiliated with NEA, AFT, UFCW, AFSCME, and lots more were instrumental in this work. So grounded in that knowledge that rank and file pressure is really one of the only ways to extract meaningful concessions from anyone as your average worker, we were able to kind of work together quickly and effectively to mobilize for this vote. We eventually did get the buy-in from some labor leaders and higher ups. After the vote, we ended up talking to one state federation president who said that it felt to her like this was the deciding factor. So the floor discussion during the meeting itself and the process leading up to the vote were very tense and dramatic, but in the end, it was all the work that we had done over the previous 2 weeks, getting down and doing that network mapping, those phone calls, those emails, talking to everybody we could think of, and trying to put pressure on delegates to the council that really won the day. So SPOG ended up expelled that night by a considerable margin. So I was also asked to reflect on something that we changed course on or could have done differently or better. And I think one thing that we weren't prepared for, if we want to think about how this moves forward, was the very cynical sort of weaponization of identity politics that the police union and their supporters ended up using. We heard numerous times during the meeting accusations that this was actually an all-white block of activists speaking over the diverse Seattle community that very much wanted the police. We heard that actually all unions are inherently racist. Racism is the ocean we all swim in, and therefore is beyond the pale to excommunicate a small group based on accusations of racism, that we all had work to do to heal ourselves. So I don't think we were really prepared for the level of cynicism that was used there. And I think as these fights move forward, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we're ready to counter those arguments with the explicit material conditions that we know underpin so much of the police violence in this country. And I think we have to be clear-eyed about our political vision and our demands. So anyway, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for having me. And a big thanks again to Alex for sharing his time with us tonight as well.
Any time left or more for some questions?
We've still got a couple of more chapters, actually 3 more chapters that want to share a little bit about their work. Next up, we have a rep from Central Jersey, I think. Take it away.
Hi, I'm Fatima from the Central Jersey chapter. So I just wanted to share a little bit about what we are working on. I think it's a little different, definitely, than a lot of other folks who are in larger cities. So New Jersey is, I think, a little unique in that it has this like label of being very progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, which comes with a lot of unique challenges. So we just, in the last couple months, had we're just starting this work now. So we're, just to share our perspective for anyone else who's thinking of starting, I can share a little bit about some of the work that we've done that's worked well and some struggles that we've had. So we've created a county-wide, so rather than working on one city or one town, we have just like a network of connections of folks because Central Jersey DSA is not just one town, it is a whole couple counties. So we chose one county that we had a lot of folks that were interested in doing defund work, and we created a coalition. So mostly DSA, but also people that we met at rallies, people we've reached out to, and who reached out to us through social media. So just kind of like putting together anyone who is on board with police abolition. So with the new coalition that we've created, we do have abolition in the name. So we're being very clear what our long-term goal is, but in terms of shorter term goals, how do we work towards abolition? It's the defund work in the meantime. So anyone who is on board with helping us defund local police departments or countywide police departments, is welcome to join our coalition. So some of the things that we decided to do was, rather than jumping into just one town or one issue, we wanted to really just collect information on what's going on in our communities, what community members are looking for, what are they interested in, what's important to them. And so we created a community survey to just find out, just to start there, to see within the different towns, what are people's experiences with the police, what are instances in which, we recognize that the police are just sort of like pushed into all of these different things that they have no business being a part of. Obviously, they shouldn't be around at all. But I think just in terms of people being able to relate, we, like I said, created this survey. So it's been really helpful just to see what what community members think. We also been talking about putting together information and just like delving into budgets and, you know, all that really boring stuff. So one of our challenges has been, you know, the rallies are all really exciting. It's, you know, marching in the streets with folks is really, you know, gets people motivated, but then you have to like sit down and like sort through like pages and pages of budget documents to find out like what's actually going on. And that's where you can really find important information. So that's been one of the challenges is getting folks to, you know, it sort of seems to be, I think in general, it's probably a situation with other chapters as well. We have like a really great core group of folks, but we need more so that they don't get totally burnt out. It is a lot of work and it's very long-term work. So yeah, I mean, another thing we're working on is finding out more information on SROs in schools, which are school resource officers, which are essentially cops in schools. In all of the towns within the county except for one, there are cops in schools from K to 12. So, you know, just all kinds of just really horrifying things that we're kind of collecting information on, trying to make sure we're educating folks. Again, like New Jersey, especially where we are in New Jersey, Central Jersey is like very liberal. They all think that like every town thinks it's amazing. Like they can't like bend over backwards enough to like pat themselves on the back for every little thing. And so when we try to bring up issues like we need to abolish the police because, you know, the whole list of reasons, we also hear, we get a lot of pushback on, oh no, our police aren't like that. That's not happening here in our towns. It's not, yeah, like those police are bad. That situation is awful. And so, you know, that can be really frustrating. Last year, we were part of a coalition that came together to fight the county purchasing a $300,000 tank for the county sheriff. And in, again, this very progressive town in the most progressive section of New Jersey, one of the most progressive states in the country, it passed 5-2. They were happy to spend that money on a military tank for our county sheriff, not on schools, not on mental health care. So we're hoping that, you know, information like that we need to bring to the wider community because a lot of people are just like really comfortable and don't even know that those kinds of things are going on. So that's the other piece is like making sure we're sharing that information out with people. So we've created like an Instagram, a Twitter, and if it's okay, I'd like to drop it in the chat just so y'all can see like, you know, where we are with like this initial work. So I'm going to pop it in there. And also the community survey, like I said, it seems like something really simple, but it's actually been a really great piece of information for us to find out what are the things that are going to motivate our community members, right? So again, this is long-term work. This is like nitty-gritty, not super exciting work, but if you can find the things that people really identify with and get really motivated by, you can use that then to radicalize them. So yeah, it's been interesting and the work keeps changing and you know, we're just going to do everything we can and build the coalition as much as we can.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to throw out there, I know that it's been said in chat, but after these last two chapters share with us, we'll have plenty of time to discuss and share in our breakout groups. And also a lot of the chapters that have been doing work, their representatives will be facilitators in those breakout groups so that you can ask them questions. The next chapter up that we have is someone from one of the NYC boroughs. Take it away if you're ready.
Hi, everybody. I'm Justin. I'm from the New York City chapter of DSA, specifically the North Brooklyn branch. So we have a Defund NYPD campaign, which took shape shortly after George Floyd's murder and all the protests and the uprising that kind of sprung up, you know, not just in New York City, but all around the country. So that coincided, I guess, with the lead up to New York City's city council budget vote up to approve the 2021 fiscal year budget. With COVID and everything else going on, we anticipated, you know, a big push for austerity, cuts to social services and programs that have already been kind of divested from, over decades in New York City. We expected further cuts to those, and we expected them to not cut the police budget at all. So we demanded 50% cut of the police budget. And we have a pretty huge police budget here in New York City. It's $5.6 billion. It ends up being a little bit higher than that when you factor in corrections, and also a 50% cut in the police officer personnel. So that would be about 19,000 officers removed, as well as $3 billion for budget. So the budget vote happened. They did not defund the police, as Alex said earlier. They did a little bit of accounting, moving numbers around and whatnot, so they could say that they defunded the police. What they really actually did was they took school resource officers and put them under the Department of Education's budget. And those are cops in schools. So they did not defund police. They did not get cops out of schools, which was very upsetting for us because we didn't get the demand we wanted. But I think in the process of making that demand, and there is a lot that happened leading up to that budget vote, an encampment sprung up at the city hall. People were there for over a week, round the clock. Things got pretty wild in the streets, as it did elsewhere all over the country. But that budget vote kind of cohered a lot of folks who are also engaged in this kind of abolitionist struggle, this defund the police struggle. So the next phase for our campaign, and that first phase came together very rapidly. The next phase for us is looking ahead to October, when the municipal layoffs are supposed to come down. We're expected to see 22,000 municipal layoffs in New York City. While at the same time, we're expected to see a new NYPD cadet class come in. And I think that will put us into over, like, I think the number is skewed, but I think it's about 1,000 cadets. So we're gonna have to lay off 22,000 people, municipal workers. We've, divested from a lot of public sector, a lot of programs that help New Yorkers, vital public services that have already been cut, and we're about to see more cops added to the police force, biggest police force in the country, all that. So what we're trying to do is kind of really make the connection for New Yorkers in New Yorkers' minds that, like, they're about to add more cops, or they're about to lay off a lot of public sector workers, and that's not right. Part of how we plan to do that is, trying to work with labor and reform caucuses within public sector unions, pushing our demand to, against austerity and for investing in New York, not by way of violence workers, not by way of, public safety that doesn't keep anybody safe, but by actually investing in the things that New Yorkers need. That's the second phase. The third phase will kind of kick into gear after that. And what we have coming up in New York City in 2021 is kind of an unprecedented city council race in which there will be 35 of 51 seats will be open, will be term limited out. Because the budget vote was so important, because the city council votes on the budget, it's going to be a big issue in this race, where people fall on police funding. And we're gonna make it so the people that we endorse support defunding the police, and the people that we're going to be giving a really hard time when they say they don't defund the police and when they vote for another bad budget. I guess if there's anything that we had to change course on, I think this was interesting, and this is kind of related to what Chuck was talking about in Seattle, but one of the things that we did in the first phase was we did some direct actions, in addition to supporting the ongoing direct actions happening in the city that kind of sprung up spontaneously. We planned some of our own, in which we, had rallies and marched to council members' homes, specifically the speaker City Council Speaker, Corey Johnson, the Majority Leader, Lori Cumbo, and one of the heads of the Budget Committee, Daniel Drum. That's in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, respectively. They didn't like that. Particularly Lori Cumbo didn't like that. Lori Cumbo and New York City DSA have some history. We ran a city council race against her back in 2017 and did not win that, but now Jabari Brisport, that candidate in that race, is now in the state Senate. Lori Cumbo had some nasty things to say about DSA, calling us a bunch of quote unquote white gentrifiers. It's funny because she is responsible for a great deal of gentrification in her district with the land use decisions that she's made. So we find that quite comical. But council members kind of talking about gentrification when they have been the cause of gentrification is interesting. It's a funny contradiction, but we're going to put that to use in these campaigns that we're going to be running for city council, where land use, in addition to policing, will be a really big issue. So I'm looking forward to talking more about this in the breakouts, but I will drop a link to our campaign website where you can sign up to get more information if you want to hear more about it. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much. And now we've got one more chapter, Austin DSA. We've got a rep from Austin.
Hi, I'm Seneca from Austin DSA. The context of defund was pretty specific. I think the reason why it played out the way it did had a lot to do with previous organizing and issue campaigns that had taken place over the last 2 years prior. So some of the immediate context is that towards the beginning of the year, a report on the kind of top brass Austin Police Department had come out showing that there was widespread, surprise, racist and homophobic behavior, that the president of the police union, Ken Cassidy, who we'll come back again to later, had gone out of his way to conceal behavior from investigators from third-party audit that was being done, and that one of the assistant police chiefs had used city funds to pay for conversion therapy for his child. So from there, things got worse. So a few weeks prior to the killing of George Floyd, Austin Police Department killed Mike Ramos in South Austin. He was unarmed. He was in his car when a neighbor called suspecting that he was doing drugs in his car. He wasn't, and also, who gives a fuck? He was first shot with a less than lethal round from a cadet 3 months out of the academy, and then was murdered by another officer who had killed a civilian exactly a year prior. So there was, prior to things kicking off, a huge push to delay the oncoming cadet class, as well as to fire Brian Manley, who was the chief of police. Austin DSA had gone ahead and signed on to the demand to end the cadet class, resisting the demand to fire Manley because we believed that he would be replaced by somebody equally bad. And then things got really bad, right? So with the murder of George Floyd, protests rightfully popped off across the country, and that included in Austin, Texas. Within the first weekend of protest, we had a pregnant Black woman shot in the stomach at one of the protests, and an Austin DSA member shot in the face while standing on the curb with a less than lethal round. His face was shattered, including his orbital bone. He is still eating out of a straw to this day, if I remember correctly. So this created a really strong set of evidence. So we, along with a lot of the rest of the kind of left coalition in Austin, put a kind of floor on demands of ending a great deal of militarized tactics, as well as cutting a bare minimum of $100 million out of APD's budget. PD's budget is roughly 40% of the discretionary fund, so $440 million out of $1 billion or so. And we did a few things. First, although we were not leading protests, we understood that the background level of protest and unrest was very important to us being able to impose cost on our elected officials. So we basically repurposed our mutual aid committees, as well as basically everyone who had other types of street medic support to act as support for existing protests, to make them viable, to make sure that people are able to stay safe and go out longer. Second of all, we started mobilizing people for protests that we knew were going to be larger. And then third, we began coordinating massive constituent contact. So we were phone banking our membership, text banking our membership to turn out to key council dates, working on talking points together, and coordinating testimony to kind of highlight the evil nature of Austin Police Department during the first phase, as well as working with our elected member. Greg Kazar is a DSA member on Austin City Council to craft resolutions that would further push back on APD's power. And so that was pretty successful in the first phase because this was immediately after, tens of thousands of Austinites had seen the police department brutalizing people of all races on camera without provocation. The worst thing that happened to any police officer in that initial weekend when several people were maimed is that some got hit with some plastic water balls. So that initial phase, we majorly focused constituent contact. We had members create a tiny CC/defund APD that led to a splash page with just list of actions you could do to put pressure on existing elected officials. And then we basically used a relational organizing strategy and had folks share the link and explain it to 3 to 5 of their friends. And this multiplied pretty quickly. So this was the issue in Austin City Council that had the most contact of anything ever. And of the roughly 20,000 or so contacts during the initial wave, around 7,000 or so came from that very simple tiny CC/defund AP. So we, over this time, built up our list of people who could go out to existing protests. We helped the new student leftist organization, Austin Youth Liberation Movement, form and help them put on their first protest so that we could continue the cycle to keep these things in the media. And we also had something that seemed unrelated but turned out to be crucial, which is that one of our members, Jose Garza, in a runoff for a district attorney race. And because people were stuck in their homes, we were motivating a lot of people into the phone banks. This turned out to be super important because it essentially allowed us to use this as a barometer. The existing DA was the last person who was taking tons of money from the Austin Police, more than every other candidate combined. And Jose was the first of many candidates in races in this runoff to reject all police money. So this made it essentially a referendum on defund, and Jose won by a 30-point landslide. This scared the shit out of everybody on council. The second thing that was seemingly unrelated but proved to be very helpful was that a conservative broken windows policing group called Save Austin Now had a petition to recriminalize homelessness, and all as a proxy for defund, because it was all about law and order policing. And many of our organizers realized that they were, me included, that they were not quite on track to get their signatures to get on the ballot. So we once again used a relational organizing strategy to recruit about 40 volunteers after one of our volunteers was very badly abused by their paid canvassers, and essentially went everywhere that they were attempting to gather signatures during the runoff and told people they were lying. And it got to the point where they would leave as soon as we showed up. The bottom line of this is although they turned in 24,000 signatures, they only had 18,000 valid ones. This was another thing that freed up space because City Council was really scared that if they went too far on defund, that they would essentially be handing an election to Save Austin Now. By successfully defeating that, we gave ourselves room. As far as things that we had to pivot, there were a few. The first, of course, was having to build a counter canvassing operation in the middle, so what I was just talking about, Save Austin Now. The second was that our power map was inaccurate at the beginning. So, a lot of highly disruptive tactics were used fairly early on, right? Visits to council members' homes and things like that. In some of those cases, we were visiting people who were going to vote our way. And this put some votes in jeopardy. So, highlighted the importance of making sure that we had accurate intelligence before we turned up the heat. Also, as defund went further on, the coalition's demands got further and further apart from one another. So Austin Justice Coalition and grassroots leadership, who we were both working with pretty heavily, got further away from one another. As we got closer to the vote, and we were up against a hard time crunch because the budget had to be passed by a certain date, we had to make sure that we moved from our general demands, defund by this much, fire this person, right, to making sure that our member on council was writing specific amendments and that we were whipping votes for those amendments. It was really important that the low-hanging fruit, the things that weren't up to our standards, got to unanimous consent early so that we would be able to push for more things. So making sure that you have track of all the amendments that are before you, that you have an accurate idea of your vote count, and that you are using your massive turnout to whip votes for those things can help, especially when you have a ticking clock. So that was what got us from just decoupling to eventually decoupling and killing all police overtime and 3 cadet classes. This is really important because we have ironclad contracts in Texas, so you can't just up and fire officers. You'll just get sued and then they'll get hired again. So to really make them feel financial burn, we had to make sure that we got the overtime and that we got the cadet classes, because that's where we could save real money. Then that we decoupled, even though that wasn't moving officers out, because the police budget increases as a percentage of its baseline. So by moving things out of that ledger, a 3% or a 5% increase later on the line is smaller. Also, maybe cops should run internal affairs anyway. It seemed like a good idea. Finally, there's what's called a Reimagine task force. So there's $65 million of the APD budget that they don't have access to right now. That will be determined later. So that means we have to continue to do policy advocacy, where we have the option of doing things like completely eliminating equine units because horses are for trampling protesters, eliminating canine units, and then hopefully, and this is on the table right now, eliminating using officers for traffic enforcement. So having like unarmed traffic. And so all those things were really possible because of the turnout, the targeted electoral wins, and because of the more specific policy advocacy.
All right, thanks so much. I just wanted to say a couple of things before we break out into our breakout groups. The first thing is, obviously, I want to thank Professor Vitale for spending his time to speak with us tonight. I want to thank each and every chapter that shared a little bit about the work that they're doing across this nation. I want to thank all the people who sent me very kind messages privately in chat. I couldn't get to them all, but I saw them. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed putting this together, and I'm glad that you've found some value in it. And then also my comrades on the National Political Education Committee, because they gave me lots of support and helped put this together with me. Last but not least, before we break out, I want to invite anybody who's on this call that is not a member of DSA to join. I'm a member, have been for a couple of years now. You can go to dsausa.org/join to do that. And then also, if you are Black, Indigenous, or a person of color who's looking to get plugged in, whether you're a member of DSA or not, I've recently joined the AfroSoc caucus, Afro Socialist and Socialist of Color. If you're interested in getting involved with them, because these people are the ones who are leading the charge in a lot of chapters across the nation to defund the police. You can email afrosoc@gmail.com. With that being said, we're going to go into our breakout room so that we can have a vigorous discussion on defunding the police.